Good evening, everyone. This is Ashley from Martin and Ash. I know I'm like a eclipse or fart in the wind. I come and go. Never know when I'm gonna pop up. I just get bored easily, I guess. I don't know. But here I am back again, reading from another book. This book is the book Tales for the Midnight Hour by J.B. Stamper. The story I'm going to be reading is Train Through Transylvania. Train jerked to a halt in the foothills of Transylvania. Inside one of the small compartments, Stephanie Archer looked nervously out the window. "I wonder what's the matter," she asked. Her mother and brother sitting across from her both shrugged their shoulders. "I'm glad it's still daylight," Stephanie said, looking out at the dense green forest around them. "Scared of vampires?" her brother asked. "Oh, sure," Stephanie answered sarcastically. "Well, then you won't mind if I read to you from Dracula, will you?" "I thought it was fitting, us riding through Transylvania." Mrs. Archer sighed. "Really, Robert?" Then the slow grinding of the wheels against the track began again. Soon the train had picked up its normal speed. Stephanie settled back against the old velvet seat and relaxed. Robert pulled a battered copy of Bram Stoker's Dracula from his knapsack. Mrs. Archer went on reading her novel. The three of them had the compartment which could sit six, all to themselves. Robert began to read aloud from Dracula. There lay the Count, but looking as if his youth had been renewed, for the white hair and mustache were changed to dark iron gray, the cheeks were fuller, and the iron white skin seemed ruby red underneath. The mouth was redder than ever, for on his lips were gouts of fresh blood, which trickled from the corners of the mouth and ran over the chin and neck. "Oh, stop it, Robert," Stephanie interrupted. "I was just trying to set the mood for our journey," Robert protested. "Here we are in the heart of vampire country. We might as well enjoy it." "Robert, stop reading aloud if it bothers Stephanie," Mrs. Archer insisted. "We'll be meeting your father in Birchurst tomorrow. Thank goodness. Then I'm turning both of you over to him." Robert picked up Dracula again and started to read silently. Stephanie gazed out the window. The train was climbing out of a valley into the mountains. "Listen to this," Robert exclaimed, and started to read aloud again. It seemed as if the whole awful creature were simply gorged with blood. He lay like a filthy leech. "Mother, make him stop it." I'll stop, Robert said hastily. "I didn't know you were so sensitive, Stephanie." Just then the rain came to another halt. All three of them looked to see where they were. A station sign read, "Mahadia." "Quite a few people are getting on," Robert said, craning his head out the window. "I hope no one comes in here," Stephanie said. But a minute later they heard footsteps in the corridor, and the door to their compartment slid open. A short, well-dressed elderly man stuck his head inside.
"May I join you? I'm afraid the other compartments are full."
"Of course," Mrs. Archer said. "Please, come in." The elderly man sat down by the door beside Stephanie.
"My name is Dr. Mortar. You are Americans, are you not?"
"Yes, that's right. I'm Mrs. Rita Archer. This is my daughter Stephanie and my son Robert." The old man beamed a smile at everyone.
"Very happy to meet you."
The train jerked forward and then began to pull out of the station. "Where do you—" Mrs. Archer began to say to the doctor, but then stopped as the compartment door slid open again. A tall, middle-aged man walked into the compartment. He didn't say a word. Without hesitation, he walked to the window and sat down on the other side of Stephanie. Stephanie glanced at the new man sitting beside her. She saw his black hair, white skin, and red lips. They were red. Those lips, ruby red. Stephanie looked over to Robert. Robert met her gaze and raised his eyebrows. The second stranger's presence invaded the entire compartment. No one seemed to know what to say. Stephanie moved over to the seat, closer to the old doctor. It had suddenly seemed to her that the dark stranger's body was cold, unnaturally cold. She started to shiver and couldn't stop. "Robert, could you get me a sweater?" Sure, Steph." Robert stood up to get a sweater from the overhead rack. As he did, the copy of Dracula fell from his lap onto the floor at the stranger's feet. Robert scooped to pick it up, but the stranger already had it in his bony hand. He gave it back to Robert. There was a smirk on his face, and his hard black eyes looked deep into Robert's. Robert sat down again, forgetting about the sweater. Mrs. Archer handed over her sweater to Stephanie. Then she said to the doctor, "It's always nice to have a doctor around." The old doctor smiled kindly. Everyone settled back into an awkward silence. The strange man sat perfectly still beside Stephanie as the light began to fade in the sky. His white face took on a greater contrast to his black hair and black suit. Stephanie cast quick glances at him as she pretended to stare intently out the window. She couldn't get the words from Dracula out of her mind. This man was so strange, and they were in Transylvania. "Robert," Mrs. Archer said softly, "will you switch on the light, please? It's getting difficult to read." As Robert reached up to flick on the light switch, the doctor reached over and touched his arm.
Please, Mrs. Archer, wait a few more minutes with the light if you don't mind. As a frequent traveler through these parts, I would recommend watching the countryside now. It is twilight near sunset. The sky will be full of beautiful colors in the next half hour. You really shouldn't miss it.
"Of course, doctor," Mrs. Archer agreed. Stephanie leaned her head against the seat back. If only she could enjoy the countryside, she thought. With that man so close to her. The train took a sharp turn and everyone was thrown to the right. The stranger's body pressed against Stephanie. She tried to move away, but her body was wedged between him and the doctor. The train straightened its course, but the man didn't move away from Stephanie. She turned to him. He was looking deep into her eyes. Just as she felt herself about to scream, he moved away from her. The train puffing to a slow stop at a small village called Orsava. Suddenly, unbelievably, the dark stranger got up and left the compartment as quickly as he had entered it. They watched him as he stepped into the station platform and walked toward a young woman who was waiting there. As the train drew away from the station, they could see the two kissing. Robert and Stephanie looked at each other and then started to laugh hysterically. Mrs. Archer smiled as she rearranged her things on the seat. The old doctor continued to smile at everyone. "You two are ridiculous," Mrs. Archer said to Stephanie and Robert. "Stop giggling." But then she laughed herself. "I think I'll go and wash up now," Mrs. Archer said. She stood up and turned around to reach for her bag on the overhead rack. After she got it down, she stopped to check her face in the mirror. In the reflection behind her face, she saw Stephanie sitting alone on the opposite seat. Where did the doctor?" she began to say, but when she did turn around, to her surprise, the doctor was still in his seat. How odd, Mrs. Archer thought as the train plunged into another dark mountain tunnel. She sat back down again. The shrill train whistle pierced through the air. The rattle of the wheels on the tracks echoed throughout the tunnel. No other sound could be heard in the pitch blackness of the compartment. 3 minutes later, the train shot back out into the velvet blue twilight. "Stephanie!" Mrs. Archer shrieked. Stephanie was slumped across the seat, her head thrown back. Blood dribbled from two small holes in her neck. An unnatural smile played on her lips. "Doctor?" she sighed. But the doctor was gone, and a full moon shone brilliantly in the Transylvanian sky. The end.
Don't be scared. Like, subscribe.